September 12, 1944. The Allied advance was a relentless, triumphant surge across France and Belgium. It had culminated in the liberation of Paris, feeding a dangerous fantasy among the high command. The war was all but over. General Eisenhower, driven by the overconfident assumption that German armies were shattered and required only a final push, directed his forces straight toward the industrial heartland of the Reich. That heartland was the Ruhr. This path ran directly through Aachen, a city that was not merely a geographic objective, but the symbolic gateway to the German homeland. The belief that Allied troops would be home for Christmas was a comforting lie. It evaporated instantly upon contact with the Westwall. The illusion of a swift victory began to shatter on this crucial date. It marked the beginning of an arduous 5-week struggle that irrevocably changed the timetable for the end of World War II in Europe. Task Force Lovelady initiated the first penetration of the Reich border at Reutlingen. The atmosphere was immediately and chillingly different from the joyful chaos the Americans had grown accustomed to in France and Belgium. The houses were draped in white sheets, symbols of surrender and defeat. Yet the civilians who watched the tanks roll past bore only a dazed mask of surrender. There was no applause, no celebration. Only a curious, unsettling silence. That silence lasted only moments. The advance was rudely greeted by enemy fire. On that sunny September 12, 1944, the world turned instantly perilous. Vicious fire erupted from both sides of the roadway. Lieutenant Richard S. Burroughs, conducting reconnaissance near Reutlingen, met his end by a blast of pillbox fire. Nearby, Lieutenant A.P. Hall was cut down by a sniper. The German army, though retreating and fragmented, had found its spine on its own soil. They were utilizing the immense defensive structure that was the Westwall. The sheer, physical presence of this defense line, known to the Allies as the Siegfried Line, was a profound shock. Task Force Dohn probed the defenses south of Oberforstbach. Meanwhile, Task Force King encountered a deliberate and effective trap in the dense, silent gloom of the Rairina woods. The ground was meticulously seeded with obstacles. Camouflaged telemines gave way to rope chains of mines, then massive steel gates, and finally, intimidating endless rows of pyramid-shaped concrete blocks. These were the infamous Dragon's Teeth. These defensive rows disappeared into the heavily wooded area. Their presence was often masked by overgrowth of grass and shrubbery, making them difficult to spot until the American armor was already upon them. The Westwall was a complex, brutal system. Its pillboxes were virtual concrete forts, immense structures 20 to 25 feet high, with walls 4 to 8 feet thick. German observers noted the neglect. Oberst Müller reported that practically nothing had been prepared for its defense. General Lieutenant Schack lamented that many pillboxes were filled with water and devoid of equipment, but this neglect did not negate their psychological or physical power. Firing slits were clogged with dirt, ventilation systems were broken, and German troops were often exhausted and battle-weary with meager ammunition supplies. Yet the massive concrete shells still demanded specialized equipment and immense courage to breach. The German defense, however desperate, was tenacious. General Lieutenant Friedrich August Schack, commanding the 81st Corps, was stressed and highly excitable, managing a rapidly disintegrating front. Units were cobbled together, comprising convalescents and insufficiently trained replacements of all age classes. General Lieutenant Hans Schmidt, commanding the severely weakened 275th Infantry Division, ordered his men to defend to the last cartridge. The chaos was palpable. Schmidt's own command car was ambushed by an American patrol, resulting in his wounding and the capture of his driver. This dramatic personal account highlighted the sudden vulnerability of the German High Command. Elements of the U.S. 30th Infantry Division advanced toward Maastricht, finding momentary relief where people were ringing church bells. But the reality around Aachen was grim. The initial attempts to rush the Westwall proved futile, offering a stark lesson in attritional warfare. Hitler's order for a mandatory civilian evacuation of Aachen plunged the city into sheer turmoil. It was a chaotic scene of crying women and children desperately walking away on the roads. Their flight was dictated by inflammatory leaflets threatening to brand those who disrupted evacuation as traitors. The fight for Aachen, the first German city to be besieged and captured by Allied forces, had become an unavoidable objective. It was a grim, grinding initiation into the true cost of fighting on German soil. The American advance, fueled by hubris, had met the unyielding concrete and desperate tenacity of a cornered enemy. The shattering of expectations on September 12th was the first brutal step into the grueling green nightmare that lay ahead. The initial costly penetrations of the Westwall had shattered the myth of the shattered Wehrmacht. Yet they had not yielded the strategic breakthrough the Allied High Command craved. Instead, the advance devolved into a brutal, piecemeal struggle. It became a grinding battle of attrition, where every yard gained was earned through blood and specialized demolition. The Westwall was not a single, easily breached barrier. It was a vast, interconnected system that demanded destruction. One pillbox, one dragon's tooth, one ridge at a time. The terrain itself became an adversary. Task Force Doan pushed against the shill line, encountering the formidable concrete teeth. But the advance was immediately slowed by the Germans' effective demolition strategy. Roads were cratered, and bridges like those spanning the Wurm River were blown, forcing infantry to consider attacking across the rubble rather than waiting for the engineers. American armor, the spearhead of the advance, was immediately fraught with peril. The ingenious Scorpion flail tank, designed to detonate mines and clear a path, became a symbol of this difficult reality when it tangled itself in the dragon's teeth. For long, terrible moments, Sergeant Sverre Wiggy Dahl and his crew became very important people. They were exposed under murderous enemy artillery fire and incoming small arms fire as they risked their lives to disentangle the machine. Only after this desperate act of bravery could the column push through. Yet, even the breached line was a death trap. Lieutenant Colonel Doan, moments after witnessing the breakthrough, saw 7 of his tanks ablaze. German tactics were sound and deadly. Concealed anti-tank guns and 88mm artillery, often hidden in buildings or terrain folds, inflicted heavy casualties on advancing armor. The air, thick with the coppery scent of pulverized concrete and the acrid smell of burning fuel, was a constant, grim reminder of the relentless threat. The fight immediately shifted to securing the high ground. These positions were non-negotiable for success. The Verlautenheid Plateau, soon christened Dawson's Ridge, and Hill 287, known to the Americans as Donnerberg, became the focus of intense, visceral combat. These hills were like a balcony from which the enemy can observe the complete show. Their capture was crucial for artillery observation and forward movement. On the clear, warm morning of September 16th, Captain Joseph T. Dawson's Company G seized the Verlautenheid Plateau. The men, exhausted but triumphant, watched as hundreds of unsuspecting German soldiers marched southeast in columns of twos. They were oblivious to the American presence now dominating the ridge. Dawson ordered his men to open fire on command, unleashing a devastating, shocking volume of small arms fire. It caught the Germans completely by surprise. The resulting casualties were heavy. That American victory was only momentary. Dawson's Ridge was too important. It immediately drew the attention of the German High Command. Oberst Engel's 12th Infantry Division was rushed to the sector. This was a fresh, well-equipped and battle-hardened force pulled directly from the Eastern Front. Their sudden arrival instantly lifted German morale. Crucially, it slammed the dangerous gap in the Westwall shut. The following day, September 17th, the weather delivered a punishing blow. Rain and clouds brought what the men called a grueling green nightmare. Company G on Dawson's Ridge endured pure hell. German artillery and mortar fire, made brutally accurate by observation from nearby Crucifix Hill, rained down relentlessly. The troops estimated 4,000 mortars and another 4,000 artillery shells fell that day. The concussions shattered every window in Ubach. They created violent geysers of dirt that sprayed constantly over the American foxholes. The hard, flat blasts of mortars endlessly filled the air. Captain Dawson watched, stunned, as the German infantry advanced directly through the apocalyptic barrage. They came in waves of about 150 men each. Theirs were well-disciplined troops who kept coming despite crippling losses. Lieutenant Colonel Orr later recalled, the waves were so intense that even hardened machine gunners became literally sick at the way they had to mow the line of men down. The intensity was undeniable. One captured German soldier reported he had never encountered such devastating small arms fire in his life. The lines were almost touching. Company B faced the enemy merely 50 yards away. the air thick with the whine of rifle rounds and the frantic chatter of machine guns. The fight for Hill 287 was equally desperate. By September 18th, the hill was the primary objective for Task Force Hogan. Captain Ferry's Company C, already severely depleted, launched an assault toward Depenlinchen, shrouded in dense fog. At 0430 hours they moved, visibility limited to no more than 50 feet, but the Germans were waiting patiently. The company was rudely greeted by very heavy artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire, all perfectly zeroed in. The fates of war for Captain Ferry's Company C took a dramatic turn for the worse. The company had started with 6 officers and 120 men. By nightfall, they were reduced to 2 officers and 62 men. The urban combat in Depenlinchen and Munsterbusch was a grinding, agonizing process. German defenses were cunningly designed. Tanks were concealed within the high walls along the streets, affording them excellent fields of fire against the advancing Americans. Their infantry utilized underground passageways connecting building cellars and strongpoints. This architecture prevented American infantry from ever getting close enough to the armor. Lieutenant Colonel Doane noted the enemy employed sound tactics, making the attack that much more difficult. American progress was measured in feet, not miles, against a dreadful defense fire of heavy machine guns, 20mm anti-aircraft guns, and constant barrages of bazooka and grenade fire. Sergeant Watson, fighting at the edge of Stolberg, reported the enemy was shooting out his periscopes, firing bazookas, and throwing grenades at extremely close range. The toll was immense. The remnants of Company F began to break under the extended strain, with many men shocked and suffering from combat exhaustion. By September 19th, American forces were pushed to their absolute limit. A desperate request for replacements was denied due to the urgencies of war. As Bork, this forced continued offensive operations with critically depleted strength. The assaults on Donneberg Fortress, otherwise known as Hill 287, were disasters. Tanks mired down and were abandoned. Infantry were pinned down by hotter-than-hell enemy mortar and artillery fire. Heavy artillery barrages scattered the forces. Captain Anderson's men, attempting a frontal attack, were even caught by friendly fire, with American artillery landing short and causing deadly tree bursts. The 36th Armored Infantry Regiment alone lost about 300 men in the last 5 days. The German resistance, commanded by men like Generalleutnant Schack, and bolstered by Hitler's directive to hold the Westwall or go down with the Westwall, had achieved a costly stalemate. The battle for Aachen had become a proving ground where the overconfidence of the Allied dash across Europe was met by the grim, unyielding reality of fighting on German soil. The primary factor halting the American advance was not logistical shortages, it was the sheer brutal resilience of enemy resistance. It was in this moment of utter exhaustion, on the night of September 20th, that Captain Armand R. Levasseur, Adams's S3, conceptualized a desperate measure. He had seen the line of dragon's teeth from the northeast edge of the woods. He knew conventional attacks were suicide. While shaving, he visualized the enemy, sleepless and exhausted from the previous day's attacks and night shelling. He proposed a novel approach, a silent night attack. It would use only bayonets, with absolutely no supporting fires, leveraging the dense fog that limited visibility to 50 feet. The risk was astronomical, but the potential reward was breakthrough. The tactical surprise worked perfectly. The infantry bypassed defenses and achieved their objective with minimal casualties, capturing 30 Defices prisoners. The subsequent seizure of Weissenberg on September 20th was a critical success. It directly hampered German offensive capabilities. But the fighting remained attritional, brutal, and utterly transformative. The initial Allied belief in a swift victory had been permanently replaced by the grinding, terrible understanding that the war in Europe would be decided yard by bloody yard. The grinding, attritional stalemate that had gripped the First Army around Aachen demanded a radical strategic shift. The 7th Corps, battered and depleted by the brutal, costly fighting for the Westwall, was ordered to consolidate and go on the defensive on September 21st. The hard-won ground, from the railroad tracks outside Stolberg to the shell-blasted ruins of the high ground, had been secured at an immense, unacceptable cost. The lesson was clear to the High Command. Frontal attacks on the main Westwall defences near Aachen were simply a bloodbath. General Corlet's 19th Corps was now tasked with finding the seam, the weak point in the Siegfried Line, and penetrating it north of the city to complete the encirclement. The new plan hinged on meticulous reconnaissance and specialized training, born from the bitter experience of previous failures. The assault troops, many of whom were replacements thrown into the grueling green nightmare of the Westwall, were forced to undergo intensive, specialized instruction. Previous training had proven woefully insufficient against the sheer density of German fortifications. The key now was the river, the Wurm, and the heavily guarded pillboxes along its banks. On September 22nd, a four-man patrol led by Lieutenant Robert F. Cushman set out to determine the Wurm's width and depth, moving with the utmost stealth. Their approach was nearly compromised by broken china that the Germans had strung along the approach, a primitive but effective alarm system. Private Unis recalled the deceptive gurgling, grating sound Cushman initially mistook for a shallow stream. It turned out to be a mechanized vehicle operating near the pillboxes. But Cushman, moving with the cold calculation of a hunter, found his viable crossing point. This was a deliberate choice to bypass the most heavily fortified sectors, a choice that would potentially save countless American lives. This discovery directly altered the entire assault plan. The Rimberg-Pallenberg section, 9 miles north of Aachen, was selected as the new point of attack. On October 2nd, the 19th Corps launched its attack. The pre-assault bombardment was deafening, a desperate attempt to soften the concrete before the men went in. 12 battalions of artillery, including the 258th and 197th Field Artillery Battalions, hammered the German lines. The 155mm self-propelled guns and M10 tank destroyers from the 18 to 103rd Battalions fired concrete-penetrating fuses, achieving some results. But the fortifications proved terrifyingly resilient. Even direct hits from the 155mm guns only removed about 4 feet of concrete and some dirt, leaving the occupants shaken up by the impact but otherwise unhurt. The aerial bombardment, meant to be overwhelming, was almost a total failure. Jelly bombs refused to ignite in the damp foliage. The infantry went in, motivated by a message delivered by Lieutenant Colonel Frankland. He promised them a Christmas homecoming if they cracked the line, a message that resonated deeply. But the moment the men of the 117th Infantry Regiment hit the open ground, the meticulous sand table models and specialized training dissolved into chaos. Captain Hopp's Company E faced immediate hardship. They crossed a 400-yard open field under a sheet of heavy mortar and artillery fire, punctuated by increasing sniper activity from a row of houses. The German delaying tactics culminated in a spectacular, almost theatrical explosion at the 7-foot-thick walls of the Marienburg Church, its steeple obliterated, sent timbers and bricks hurtling hundreds of feet into the air. Captain Hoppy, watching the blast, thought it was just like Hollywood. It was a surreal moment of violence before the inevitable plunge back into the fight. The planned combined arms assault collapsed instantly. The tanks, the crucial support element, became bogged down in the mud, targeted by relentless artillery. One culvert, intended to bridge the gaps, became hopelessly stuck in the water. The infantry was left to advance alone, navigating draws, beet fields, and slag piles. This terrain perfectly canalized their movement and offered the enemy excellent observation. Company C, advancing through a draw, found it jammed full of the boys carrying their bridges while under relentless artillery fire. Private James A. Smallwood watched in horror as his platoon was wiped out in a few minutes under a devastating volley. The Wurm River itself, cold and chest-deep, presented the first physical barrier. The advance became a testament to raw individual initiative. Sergeant Lewis A. Reeves and Private James W. Harris, ignoring the intense enemy fire, plunged into the frigid water to stabilize the bridge planks. Moments later, Lieutenant Borton, leading the 2nd Platoon of Company B, stood on the riverbank. His face grimed with dirt and sweat. He roared, "Let's go, guys." He waded across the river himself, stabilizing the planking. Then, standing up, dripping wet and exposed, he proclaimed, "There's your goddamned bridge." Company B, under Captain Spiker, achieved the critical breakthrough. They raced across the makeshift bridge and immediately crashed into the Westwall defenses. The fighting devolved into a chaotic, close-quarters slugfest against the concrete giants. Lieutenant Cushman's platoon led the reduction of the pillboxes. The air filled with the stench of burning oil and the acrid smell of explosives. Private Brent Younes and Private Jenkins, the assault engineers, became the vital, terrifying spearhead. Younes, a flamethrower strapped to his back, moved with the infantry, his tank of jellied gasoline a beacon of lethal intent. They used flamethrowers to drive the Germans back from the firing slits, followed immediately by pole charges. These were massive blocks of explosives, taped to long sticks thrust against the concrete walls. The attack on Pillbox 6 was a microcosm of the entire operation, complex, brutal, and improvised. Rifle grenades flew, flamethrowers spewed their orange death, and satchel charges were detonated. Private William W. Smith was killed assisting with the flamethrower operations, a silent casualty in the deafening, frantic noise. At Pillbox 4, the combination of smoke, flame, and concussion proved too much. 10 Germans emerged, hands raised, their faces bearing the dazed mask of surrender, their uniforms singed. A German officer attempting a defiant last stand was cut down by Sergeant Daniel Preston, and the seizure of Rimberg Castle, a medieval strongpoint incorporated into the Westwall, was equally ferocious. The 1st Battalion, the vanguard of the assault, stormed the old dark stone fortress. For a time the castle seemed to be seeping smoke from every arrow slit that forgotten masons had cut for medieval archers. Inside, the fight became a desperate hand-to-hand struggle. It was more like a battle in the time of Richard the Lion-Hearted than in the day of General Eisenhower. Soldiers cleared the Germans out room by room with grenades and bayonet. The clash of steel and the shouts echoed off the ancient stone. By noon on October 2nd, the Wurm had been crossed, the Westwall cracked, and a precarious bridgehead established. General Kochling, commanding the 81st Corps, later admitted the American action was completely surprising. But the cost was immense. The 117th Infantry Regiment alone suffered 232 casualties that day, bringing the total American casualties to 315. The enemy reacted immediately. That night, German counterattacks, featuring Mark VI tanks and fresh infantry, slammed into the bridgehead. Though the Americans held, the fight for Ubach quickly devolved into a nightmare of contested ground. The failure of the tanks to effectively cross the Wurm meant the infantry held the line alone, exposed. The promised breakthrough was, instead, a grinding, bloody toehold on the German homeland. The myth of a swift victory was now replaced by the terrible reality of the Siegfried Line, where every yard was bought with a life. The precarious American toehold across the Wurm River, bought at the horrific cost of hundreds of men, had successfully ruptured the Siegfried Line, yet it had not shattered the German will. Instead, the penetration only intensified the violence. The 19th Corps now found itself stuck in a brutal, house-to-house slugfest for the towns of Pallenberg and Ubach. Every cellar and church steeple concealed a new German strongpoint. The objective was clear: secure the high ground and complete the encirclement of Aachen, the stubborn, symbolic city that refused to fall. General Lieutenant Kochling, caught off guard by the American thrust, reacted with desperation. He threw every available reserve, including assault guns and armored vehicles, into the gap. The German command, despite its fragmentation, understood the strategic geometry. If the Americans closed the ring around Aachen, the city's garrison was doomed. The fighting for Ubach on October 4th was characterized by extreme, terrifying confusion. German engineers were ordered to fight to the end with no possible retreat, initiating fierce, chaotic assaults. Lines were often 50 yards or less apart, with enemy and friendly troops holding alternate houses. American soldiers, already physically and mentally depleted, were forced into situations where a platoon leader had to call for mortar fire directly onto his own positions. In one house in Ubach, Private First Class Ira Reeder suddenly found himself the center of a brutal melee. He was eating his meager breakfast ration when Staff Sergeant Roy Betts was rudely interrupted by machine gun fire. The air instantly filled with the sound of bullets splattering liberally through the structure. Reeder scrambled to the door. 2 Germans attempted to breach the house, but Reeder, bracing himself, killed them both before they could fully enter. Inside, Private First Class Anton Montoya used his BAR to chew up enemy soldiers advancing across the open ground. That rapid-fire weapon provided the only consistent cover. The defense of this single house became a microcosm of the entire battle. Desperate, close quarters, and utterly dependent on individual nerve. Crucial to holding that thin line was the overwhelming power of American artillery. This fire was often directed by men who risked their lives for a clear line of sight. Lieutenant Robert C. Burke, a forward observer, demonstrated an extraordinary, almost suicidal level of dedication. He left the relative safety of his initial post and moved through a street subjected to extremely heavy enemy fire. This included direct machine gun fire from a German tank. Finding a new vantage point, his selfless actions allowed him to direct continuous, deafening artillery barrages. These salvos turned a hostile attack on Company L into a decisive German defeat. He even scored a direct hit on a Mark IV tank, the explosion momentarily silencing the chaos. Despite these localized successes, the noose around Aachen remained loose. It was held only by the sheer determination of the infantry. The strategic high ground, Crucifix Hill and Ravensburg, remained the Germans' most potent observation points, dominating the entire landscape below. The First Army, battered but resolute, prepared for the final bloody assault to secure these hills and officially seal the city's fate. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard, a thin, intense officer who always had a German shepherd and a walking stick nearby, oversaw the meticulous planning. He ensured not a stone was left unturned, studying maps and intelligence reports of every pillbox and every approach. The men themselves christened the attack on Verlautenheide and Crucifix Hill Operation Massacre or Operation Decimation. They acknowledged the rough nature of the task with butterflies in their stomachs. The attack commenced on October 7th, after an artillery barrage that began at 0300 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Williamson's 2nd Battalion pushed into Verlautenheide. But the true crucible of courage was Crucifix Hill. This position was studded with pillboxes impervious to the preliminary bombardment. Watching the results of the air and artillery strikes, the radio operator for the assault force exclaimed in raw disbelief, "Jesus, the Air Force and the artillery didn't do a goddamned thing to those pillboxes, did they?" "What the hell happens now?" The answer came from Captain Bobbie E. Brown, a fearless Mustang officer. Facing the daunting fortifications, Brown famously declared, "I guess I'll just have to take them myself." He moved forward alone. This was not a textbook assault. It was an act of sheer, terrifying will. He crawled under direct German fire, the sound of bullets ricocheting off the rocks around him. He carried satchel and pole charges, the raw explosives necessary to breach the concrete. Reaching the first pillbox, he armed the charges, threw them inside, slammed the door shut, and leapt back over an embankment just as the blast ripped through the concrete structure. Inside, the Huns dropped like flies. Brown repeated the impossible feat. He intercepted a German soldier delivering ammunition to the main, formidable pillbox on the crest, a daring move that neutralized a key defense. He then assaulted that main position. Eyewitness Staff Sergeant James E. Osborne watched in disbelief as Brown, wounded by shrapnel but utterly undeterred, approached Pillbox 5 on Ravensburg Hill. He fingered his grenade bag and took off. When he reached the pillbox, he threw grenades until the defenders inside waved a white flag and cried, "Kamerad!" The fighting around Brown was an erupting volcano of chaos. Later, Osborne testified, "I don't know how one guy could do it, but I can verify that he personally knocked out 2 of the tanks with rifle grenades and a bazooka." The German counterattack on Crucifix Hill began shortly after 0400 hours on October 7th. It involved 3 waves of infantry and assault engineers. Brown ordered his men to hold fire until the Germans were almost on top of them. When the American machine guns and rifles finally opened up, they unleashed murderous grazing fires. These fires piled the onrushing Germans up in front of their foxholes. In the morning light, 40 dead Germans lay within rock-throwing distance of Company C's positions. Their bodies were stacked like cordwood. Brown's actions had not just secured the hill, they had annihilated the German counterforce. With Crucifix Hill secured, the final strategic objective was Ravensburg. The German command, though aware of the danger, proved unable to stop the American momentum. On the night of October 9th, American companies executed a tense, silent infiltration. They moved in single file across the Aachen-Haren road and through orchards, relying absolutely on compass and memory in the near-total darkness. They were so close to German patrols they could nearly touch the man in front of them. The infiltration was successful. By 0800 the next morning, all Ravensburg fortifications were cleared. The noose had closed. The final crucial high ground was American. On October 10th, the surrender trio, Private First Class Kenneth Kading, Gulping with nervous excitement and carrying a white bedsheet, Lieutenant William Boehm, the interpreter, and Lieutenant Cedric A. Lafley, carrying the document, walked into the shattered city. Blindfolded and interrogated, they eventually delivered the ultimatum. The response, relayed back by the newly appointed commandant, Oberst Gerhard Wilk, was dictated not by military reality, but by Hitler's fanatical decree. The message read, "The defenders of Aachen will prepare for their last battle. Constricted to the smallest space, we shall fight to the last man, the last shell, the last bullet, in accordance with the Führer's orders." The battle for the first German city had entered its final, most brutal phase, street to street, house to house urban combat. This was a nightmare for which no field manual was adequate. The Americans had won the terrain, but now they would have to pay the immense cost of clearing the rubble. The final act of the battle for Aachen was not a swift conclusion, but a systematic, brutal dissection of a dying city. Oberst Gerhard Wilk, the garrison commander, had delivered his defiant refusal to surrender, a hollow echo of Hitler's fanatical will. The American answer was not negotiation, it was annihilation. On the morning of October 11th, the clearing skies gave way to the roar of engines. 300 fighter bombers, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings swept in, completely unchallenged by German flak. They dove like stones, bleeding off 325 knots of airspeed to deliver 1,000-pound bombs and rockets. Their 50-caliber machine guns and 20mm cannons spat streams of fire during long, slanting runs. This airstrike, which unloaded 62 tons of bombs, was followed immediately by the ground shock. 12 battalions of 7th Corps and 1st Division artillery unleashed a staggering 4,800 rounds. The ground shook, not in waves but in a continuous, deafening vibration that cracked already shattered walls. The American plan was a methodical block-by-block execution of urban warfare. They called it a measles system for charting every street intersection and building. This was not a dash to the center. It was a siege powered by perfectly integrated combined arms. Each rifle, Company G on the left, E in the center, F on the right, was transformed into a self-contained demolition team. They were accompanied by 2 tanks, 2 tank destroyers, 50mm machine gun platoons, and engineer squads armed with flamethrowers and dynamite. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel, commanding the 26th Infantry, had already learned a grim truth about the fighting. He realized that, in street fighting, strange to relate, one should stay out of the street. He advocated for a tactic that was both innovative and devastatingly effective. This involved the use of a 155mm self-propelled gun, firing through windows with a quick fuse to drive out enemy occupants. General Clifton Andrus approved the tactic immediately. He set one strict limit: "I do not want it closer than 400 yards." The advance became a slow, agonizing process of clearing the rubble. In the factory district, the battle was described as prolonged bloody fighting. It was a grueling green nightmare, transposed onto brick and steel. German soldiers, organized into units like the 1st Assault Engineer Regiment, used the dense environment to their distinct advantage. They fought from tunnels they had blasted between buildings, turning the defense into a subterranean network. The combat quickly devolved into vigorous hand-to-hand melees. The sound of rapid small arms fire echoed continuously in the narrow spaces. The most brutal fighting centered around the Karl-Friedhof Cemetery. That Company F suffered crippling losses, their commander killed, leaving them stopped cold with no ground lost. The grim reality of German tenacity was everywhere the Americans turned. Soldiers were only pried out of the cellars and smelly sewers with the persistent use of grenades. Meanwhile, General Feldmarschall Model, desperate to save the symbolic city, launched his relief effort. Despite the poor weather and the objections of his subordinate commanders, the German counteroffensive was ordered forward, included the feared 3rd Panzer Division. On the ridge outside Eilendorf on October 15th, the attack commenced at first light. German grenadiers and armor, including hulking Mark VI Tiger tanks, surged forward. They had hidden in front of American positions throughout the night, waiting for dawn. The American response was instantaneous and overwhelming. The ridge erupted under a massive artillery concentration. Forward observers spotted the enemy tanks by 0800 hours. Hostile artillery and tanks closed in rapidly, reaching a very critical status by 12:58 hours. Tanks were closing to within 10 yards of American positions. Captain Joseph Dawson of Company G, still holding the battered ridgeline, suddenly found himself in a maelstrom. Suddenly, there was chaos all over the Company G area, he recalled. Nobody knew what the situation was because the enemy was in front of and on both sides of them. Dawson stood in his basement command post where the incongruous sound of dance music was emanating from a small shiny radio. He had to make an agonizing decision. I also had to call for the artillery right on us, only 10 yards in front of us, he stated. And they saved lives because the Germans were literally overwhelming us in numbers. American P-47s, piloted by men like Captain George W. Hurling Jr., strafed the German assembly area at 1340 hours. They dropped bombs directly onto the advancing tanks. The concentrated fire American artillery, 57mm anti-tank guns, and decisive air support broke the German offensive completely. But enemy tanks were seen disappearing. They left behind the dead bodies of Germans sprawled along the front. Vibrant red blood, covering their tattered field grey uniforms where they lay in the mud. General Major Denkert later reflected that the artillery fire was so strong that a continuation of the attack, even if the fire ceased, was not possible. The perimeter was stabilized. Aachen was now irrevocably doomed. The focus shifted to the final, iconic strongpoints within the city. Lieutenant Colonel Corley's 3rd Battalion, 26th Infantry, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns, launched attacks to neutralize the last German holdouts. The lobby of the Hotel Quellenhof, once a place of elegance, had become a wasteland of torn walls, shattered glass, bodies, and bloodstains. Lieutenant Nekschy's Company M undertook a daring basement clearing operation in the hotel. They descended into enemy-held territory, using grenades and executing a double envelopment to clear the last pockets of resistance. The final stand was made by Oberst Wilk and the remnants of his garrison, now numbering perhaps 2,200 men, in a subterranean air raid bunker. Willock faced the utter futility of resistance. Ammunition, food, and water were exhausted. He sent a final, desperate plea to LXXX-1 Corps, situation in Aachen, such that last resistance probably coming to an end 19 October, he wrote. Breakout via SOAS, still possible, then EQUEST decision soon. The response, filtered through the Nazi political machine, was the same fanatical command, you shall hold the venerable German city to the last man. Wilk, however, was a soldier, not a fanatic. He had watched his city bleed, and he knew the war was lost. His final order to his troops was a dramatic, yet hollow declaration of defiance, but privately, he made his agonizing decision. On Saturday morning, October 21, 1944, the atmosphere around the final redoubt was tense and silent. Oberst Wilk, acting directly against his Führer's orders, chose surrender. The formal surrender was facilitated by 2 American POWs, Staff Sergeant Ewart M. Paget and Private First Class James B. Haswell. They volunteered to carry the white flag into the bunker. Haswell had asked to borrow a cartridge belt first, explaining that the Germans had already lost 2 men trying to emerge with a white flag earlier. At 12:05 hours, the surrender was effective, and Wilk, emotionally addressing his remaining troops, acknowledged the painful occasion and the uselessness of continued fighting. He symbolically surrendered his pistol, laying it on a table after throwing the clip under a bed. It was a gesture of profound personal defeat after 28 years of service.
Interrogation immediately revealed his despair.
He confessed that the only cement which holds many German officers in place is fear. He even stated that he wished he had been killed in the fighting. His final poignant words to his captors were a testament to the shattered German will. Only America can save us now, he stated, as I don't believe in miracles anymore. The fall of Aachen was complete. The first German city had been taken. It was a victory measured not in swift triumph, but in the immense, agonizing cost of attrition. It was a stark demonstration that the war would not be home by Christmas, but would be won only through brutal, house-to-house sacrifice against a fanatical foe. The city, now dead as a Roman ruin, stood only as an object lesson in the power and application of modern warfare. The Siegfried Line had been breached.
But the war for Germany had just begun. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video.
It helps us preserve these stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.